Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this next session of today's EcoFest. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to explore with you some thoughts and reflections about somebody who's deeply inspired me. There's an American called Thomas Berry. I'm going to begin my reflections by sharing some thoughts written by a Japanese ecologist. This ecologist is called Suko Watanabe, and she's reflecting, looking back to her childhood, and she says these words: "When I was a child, I played in the rivers and fields near rural relatives. I would lie in the fields and sketch weeds for hours at a time. My mother would tell me all about different kinds of grasses and plants, and explain the medicinal uses of certain leaves, or sometimes tell me folk tales about a particular flower." She goes on to say, "I also loved to spend hours looking at the moon, musing about philosophical questions. Even when I was a child, I felt that I would have to have a life with enough time to contemplate, to let my mind range freely. And I also knew then that I wanted to live in the midst of nature." So in this quotation from Suko Watanabe, she's affirming her positive experience as a child of enjoying and appreciating the opportunity to explore the natural environment around her, including the rivers and the fields. In her drawings of the weeds that she closely observed, she also affirms the importance of paying attention, being able to focus upon that which she encounters. Being engaged in the act of drawing, she would learn about shapes, structures, textures, forms, colours, and shades of the weeds before her. And therefore, in this creative act, she was learning about the ecologies, the natural environments in which she lived. In effect, the process of creating images on the page was her engagement in a dialogue with that which she encountered, a dialogue of perception. To perceive can be defined as the capacity to become aware of, to know, to identify something or someone by means of the senses. In addition, it can also connote the experience of interpreting, viewing, or regarding phenomena in a particular way. In effect, therefore, the act of perception incorporates the development, the cultivation of a perspective, a point of view, a way of seeing. And the many and varied ways in which we experience our environments, therefore, can be synthesized, put together to form a potentially coherent worldview, philosophy of life, a way of seeing and being in the world. The very act of Suko's mother drawing her attention to the many and varied forms and kinds of plants and grasses is a very vivid example of the relationship between parent and child, in which teaching and learning being integrated into an ethos and culture of inquiry is deeply developed. Suko's mother was sharing her knowledge, her understanding of an enthusiasm for the natural world, and this clearly played a significant role in Suko's active curiosity. Her desire to experience and immerse herself totally and spontaneously in the environments she encountered. In Suko's declaration that she also just loved to spend hours looking at the moon, musing about philosophical questions, she's demonstrating her capacity to engage with what can be called ultimate questions, questions of meaning, purpose and value. And in contemplating the moon at night, in the night sky, Suko was very likely considering questions of, for example, the very nature of the cosmos and the ways in which the Earth is a significant and important part of this vast canvas of space which can appear to have no end. Whilst gazing at the night sky, Suko may have been considering questions about the beginnings, the origins of phenomenon. She confirms that such a contemplative approach has stayed with her throughout her life, and that this complements her desire to, as she says, to live in the midst of nature. In effect, therefore, it is possible to suggest that Suko's identity, her very sense of self, her capacity for flourishing, is rooted in and bound up totally with her experience of living a life lived in relationship with the natural world. I find that Suko's response to the rivers and fields of her childhood echoes the experience of Thomas Berry, aged 12, who encountered a meadow. In his book, The Great Work, he looks back to that memorable time as a child, and he says these words, and there's a slide, a picture of lilies to accompany these words. He says this: "The field was covered with lilies, rising above the thick grass. A magic moment. This experience gave to my life something, I know not what, that seems to explain my life at a more profound level than almost any other experience I can remember." For Berry, his encounter with this field of lilies when he was young had a profound impact upon the overall orientation of his life. His experience of the flowers, the insects, the clouds and woodlands was very significant for him. It was as if his senses were heightened and he had a finely tuned awareness of the world around him, so much that it affected the overall direction and viewpoint of his life. He acknowledges that this experience impacted upon his feeling for what he calls as being real and worthwhile in life. Berry's experience, I suggest, illustrates how an encounter with and a receptivity to the natural world can have far-reaching consequences. Such experiences can provide the inspiration and motivation to develop an outlook on life which affirms what is real and worthwhile. And it's very likely that each one of us has our own personal experience of this sense of awe and wonder that is evoked by the natural world. A wonderful sunrise or sunset, a starry night, a rainbow, or the radiance of a field of sunflowers, for example, can move, inspire, and even at times overwhelm us. Such experiences capture our attention and elicit positive feelings and emotions. They can be described as wonderful because they are beautiful, amazing, and even breathtaking. Such experiences can be uplifting, life-affirming, and can drastically and radically change our perspectives on things. They can inspire and encourage us to see our individual and social selves in a much larger context. They can, as it were, help us to see and experience something of what can be called the bigger picture. And experiences of nature, therefore, can enlarge our sense of self. And it's possible to discern that we are part of a greater whole, that everything on earth, indeed the whole of the universe, is in some mysterious yet intuitive and perceivable sense interconnected and interrelated. We are all, as the writer Fritjof Capra affirms, part of the glorious and diverse web of life. In his book, The Web of Life, Capra says these words: "The new paradigm can be called a holistic worldview, seeing the world as an integrated whole rather than a disassociated collection of parts. It may also be called an ecological view if the term ecological is used in a much broader and deeper sense than usual." And Capra goes on to say, "Deep ecological awareness recognizes the fundamental interdependence of all phenomena, and the fact that as individuals and as societies, we are all embedded in and ultimately dependent upon the cyclical processes of nature." In fact, in this book, The Web of Life, Capra goes on to share some of his personal experiences of nature. And I would suggest that he articulates the experience of reverential awe when he talks of this particular experience, which I'll share with you now. He says the core spirituality that comes from deep ecology. He says, "When I see people cutting down forests, I feel real pain. I have a real emotional connection to the earth." And he contrasts that with another experience when he says, "But the other side is that I feel very much at peace by the sea, by the mountains." And he concludes by saying, "These are moments when I feel most alive. This rush of feeling alive, most spiritual in the sense of the spirit as the breath of life." Thomas Berry's encounter with the field of lilies was transformative, just like the experience of the sea and the mountains was for Fritjof Capra. And Berry's experience of the field of lilies can be thought of as providing him with an orientation to life, a perspective, a worldview, in which his relationship with the natural world was central. And at the core of his philosophy, at the very centre of his way of seeing the world, is the fundamental view that we will not care for that which we do not love. We will not care for that which we do not love. Berry was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1914. In 1933, he entered a Passionist monastery, and in 1942, he was ordained as a priest. And his epiphany in the field of lilies as a child ultimately led him on a path to develop the view that the universe, the solar system, and planet Earth, in themselves and in their evolutionary emergence, constitute for the human community the primary revelation of that ultimate mystery whence all things emerge into being. So basically, Berry is saying that as human beings, sharing the planet with a wide variety of other life forms, that Earth is part of the solar system, and the solar system is part of the great universe. And therefore, in Berry's view, all that exists is a form of revelation, and we are rooted in and part of that revelation. As well as being a Christian priest, Berry described himself as a cultural historian, and his extensive studies of world religions, particularly those of China and India, informed his development as a historian of the earth. In fact, rather than calling himself a theologian or a philosopher, he coined the term geologian, a person studying the history of the earth, literally in the rocks. His thought was significantly influenced by the French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Their thought in many ways is very similar. They complement each other very deeply. And ultimately, together with the cosmologist, the scientist Brian Swimme, in 1992, Berry published the book The Universe Story, which in due course inspired a multimedia project called Journey of the Universe. We talked a little earlier about Friedrich Capra and his concept of the web of life. And I would suggest that Capra's perspectives can be regarded as complementing the cosmic vision expressed in Berry and Swimme's universe story. And this book illustrates how an understanding of the origins, the evolution and the development of the universe can facilitate the experience of awe and wonder as human beings reverentially contemplate their place in the cosmos. The second slide, which you'll see appearing, is a picture of what we might call the cosmos, one of these beautiful images of space. On the NASA website, there's a whole wealth of beautiful images of space, which are well worth looking at. And what Capra and Berry and Swimme are doing is saying that that cosmos, that universe, is not simply something out there, separate, distinct from us. We are part of it. It is our home. And therefore, Berry and Swimme say, each person can begin to develop a sense, as I said previously, that their existence, their life, their day-to-day life is part of a much bigger picture, a bigger story, a bigger narrative. And therefore, that means, ultimately, that each person belongs. They are at home in the cosmos. In fact, if you think about it, what Berry and Capra and Swimme are saying is the very fact that human beings exist, that they can think, that they are conscious, and that they themselves can look out into the night sky and contemplate these wonders and mysteries. That is a manifestation of the universe becoming self-aware. The universe, it becomes conscious of itself. It can self-reflect in the very embodiment of human beings. The Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, as well as Swimme, Berry and Capra, has also affirmed such a cosmic way of seeing humankind's relationship to the earth. And he has formulated an approach which is termed deep ecology. And deep ecology is characterized by an affirmation of the intrinsic value, the intrinsic worth of all living creatures, irrespective of how those creatures might meet the needs of human beings. In Næss's perspective, the earth and all its resources and the myriad of life forms which coexist are not thought of and looked at purely in terms of their utilitarian function, their instrumental value for human beings. Deep ecology argues that the natural world is a subtle balance, a complex yet subtle dynamic balance of interrelationships which are in a constant change, cycle of change and development and flux. All forms of life, in Ness's view, ultimately depend upon each other. No form of life, particularly human life, can exist independently of other life forms. Therefore, Ness goes on to say, the implications of such a view is that any human activity which plunders and depletes the earth's resources and leads as a consequence to the devastation of the natural world present not only a threat to humankind, but to all life forms which make up the natural order. Indeed, Ness has said himself, the challenge of today is to save the planet from further devastation. And he goes on to say, the enlightened self-interests of humans can decrease the potential of joyful existence for all. In other words, if human beings put themselves first, they're causing negative impacts upon other life forms. And then in a sense, what we sow comes back to us to haunt us. It depletes our capacity for joyful existence. In his book, Thomas Berry, Returning to Him, The Sacred Universe, he explores particularly the concept and experience of what he calls alienation. And it can be suggested that at the very heart of these early years of the 21st century and the contemporary ecological crisis, at the heart of it is humankind's alienation from themselves, from others, and from the natural world. There is therefore, in many and varied ways, a profound sense of disconnection which expresses itself throughout all dimensions of life: politics, economics, commerce, business, science, technology, ecology, the arts and spirituality. There are indeed, in all these areas of life, many significant positive developments and very innovative ideas and innovations. But it can be suggested that these creative innovations are ultimately responses to this sense of dislocation or alienation that Berry talks about. Berry describes alienation in this way. He says it is, in some sense, the most ancient and universal human experience. It is our human condition. And this alienation is ultimately the difficulty of discovering our personal identity and our proper place in the universe. And he goes on to say, in the opening years of this period of history we find ourselves, in the opening years of the 21st century, we are currently, right now, experiencing a new alienation in our inability to relate effectively to the integral functioning of the earth. For Berry, the cause of this alienation is an extreme human centeredness. And he links that also to what he calls dedication to consumerism. And he believes that it's this human centeredness, this human focus that people can have, and this dedication to consumerism that is actually at the very core of our being. And the net effect of that is we destroy the earth. And I'm following on from what Berry's saying about alienation. I'm suggesting that at the very heart of his message for today is he's saying that humankind is losing, or perhaps has already lost, the sense of what we can call the grandeur, the wonder of the earth. And as a human species, we've related to the earth in a utilitarian, instrumental way. We've treated everything as an object to serve our purposes, our needs, our desires, our wants. Everything is being viewed as a resource to use as we please. And in effect, therefore, I believe that what Berry is calling humankind to is a project, a major radical project. And at the heart of that radical project is a rediscovery of the sense of the sacred. He is encouraging each one of us to see the world differently, to see it anew, and to be transformed. He invites us to develop new ways of seeing and being, and to live in right relationship with ourselves, with each other, and with the earth. And he affirms the importance of what he calls the great work. And that phrase, the great work, appears throughout Thomas Berry's writings. And he gives his own personal definition of what he believes the great work is. I've used the word project. He uses the word also task. And he says this: the great work is the task of moving modern industrial society from its present devastating influence on the earth to a more benign mode of presence. Our own special role, which we will hand to our children, is that of managing the arduous, the difficult transition from the terminal Cenozoic to the emerging Ecozoic era. And for Berry, the period of the Ecozoic era is the period, the time in history, an emerging time in history that is currently being made in everything that people do to change the world. And this Ecozoic era for Berry is when humans will be present to the planet as participating members of the comprehensive Earth community. Participant members sharing the whole of the Earth with other life forms, not being the dominant species. Berry therefore holds the view that in this early period of the 21st century, humankind is faced with significant choices about the future direction of the entire Earth community. He calls us to a radical reconsideration of the ways in which we relate to the larger web of life, and his philosophy invites us to be agents of change in bringing about a renewed and transformed world. Such a call might sound poetic, perhaps philosophical, but actually it is a radical, practical, new vision of what is possible. And I suggest that without acknowledgement of the existential fact of alienation, which Thomas Berry has clearly drawn our attention to, it will not be possible to go beyond our narrow-minded, our myopic ways of doing things. Business as usual is not an option. A new vision, a new worldview, a cosmic perspective, I suggest, is required. And I believe that Thomas Berry's universe story and his central idea of the great work, complemented by the thinking of others such as Alienation, Fritjof Capra, and Suko Watanabe, we talked about at the beginning, and her experience as a child in the nature, in the forest. These can be transformative sources of inspiration, inviting us to respond to and engage with the challenges, the increasing and more urgent challenges which face the world today. The 19th century Polish composer Mieczysław Karłowicz expressed his feelings about his beloved Tatra Mountains when he used these words: "When I stand on the top of a steep mountain, having only the blue hemisphere of the sky above and the sea of the plateau with waves of other summits beneath, I feel as if I were blending with the surrounding space." And he goes on to say, "I cease to perceive myself as a unique entity. Instead, I sense the eternal and mighty breath of the universe. Hours spent in such a mood of semi-consciousness are felt almost as a temporary return to the state of non-existence. But he goes on to say, this experience of the mountain rewards me with peaceful thoughts on life and death. It tells me about an eternal joy melting in the universe. And following on from Karlovich's experience of the mountains, I conclude my talk with 3 open questions. Firstly, in our lives, where do we discern, discover, and locate what Karlovich talks of as being eternal joy? Where do we experience, discover, and locate eternal joy? Secondly, how can we inspire and empower our political, economic, business, commercial, educational, scientific, and technological systems to be transformed in such a way that they too can become advocates for and agents of such joy? And the third open question is, what is the role that the spiritual traditions of the world can play in bringing about the Ecozoic era? Thomas Berry's philosophy of the great work presents us with a call to personal, social, and global transformation. And I suggest that the presentations, the conversations of today's EcoFest are all examples of the creation of oases of hope and inspiration, each of which in their own ways contribute creatively to the task of the great work.